Today is the first day of this June 1985 7-day retreat. Let's first say a few things about listening to a talk. For people who have not been to a retreat, but also for all of us to think and realize what this listening to a talk is about. It is not a lecture given by one person to many persons in which something is taught. There's no information conveyed to be remembered, stored, and then acted upon. In a talk such as this, there is no authority on the part of this person who is speaking. Is one as a listener listening to an authority, thinking that there is an authority, a teacher, a Zen teacher? And can one look immediately whether such ideas and images get in the way of listening, invoking already a host of associations through which one listens? In listening to a talk, can this be a participation, as it were? Looking together, questioning together, wondering, attending, listening, at the instant, not in order to remember it in the future and then think it over. But the immediacy of it, the immediacy of listening and looking, and not knowing what will come of it. What is usually talked about most of the time is the functioning of this human mind as it manifests in all of us, not especially here or especially there. When there's this participation in a talk, there is no two minds. There's only listening and looking and questioning. And maybe seeing for oneself what is so, what is true. In sitting down to experiment with the most comfortable posture during these 7 days so that you can sit in comfort, you don't have to worry about pain in the legs or hips or knees or back, unless it's inevitable. If you need to change the posture, to do so by all means, to see if one can do it so quietly, not feeling bad that one has to change the posture whereas everybody else doesn't seem to have, but to do it, just to do it, simply do it attentively. Then whatever noise there is will not disturb. whatever sound there is, I should say. And if a neighbor is disturbed, can that be looked at immediately, this disturbance factor? So one feel one's private listening space invaded. If one sees that, it drops so quickly, because it's so irrelevant. If it's not seen, it festers on, it builds up to anger or frustration. One may have not heard something because of a sound, but one can pick it up immediately, if not this long tirade against others or oneself isn't set into motion. I was asked to announce again, it was announced this morning, I think, but not everybody was here, about not walking on the seated areas. These areas are recognized by the straw that is on them. The areas where the grass is being mowed, that's not a newly seeded area. People can walk on that, but not on what is newly seeded, where the little grass is just coming up, which is usually right around the house, the foundation. I was thinking last night in entering the sitting room, and then our opening guidelines and talks, how formal we still seem to appear. The brown mats and cushions, their arrangement, the han, the way it's hanging there in the hall. And the formality that almost inevitably seems to creep into announcements of guidelines, sometimes broken by informality. And this sort of has an effect upon one. And it's worth looking at it if one feels that effect. We don't have these brown mats and the han hanging there, and the way the cushions are arranged to maintain a tradition. We have them because we happen to have them. If we had the money right now, I think most people would agree to change the color. But that may not change the mind that's perceiving the new color, because then one may be identified with this new color, have an easier time identifying with it. Because now it's ours, and we're doing things this way here. You noticed in this retreat that may contribute to this feeling of implicit formality, the retreat out in California, where many people came from different centers, albeit all of them very structured, but getting sort of the feeling that anything goes in this retreat. And there was a lot of no structure, much less so than here. One particular one was interesting. We didn't have a waiting room. I don't like this word, waiting room. I wish we would drop it. Waiting room, waiting line, and call the room by its name. And if one is sitting in there, is one waiting for something? Obviously, one is waiting for one's turn, but as one is sitting, one doesn't need to think of one's turn. If one is thinking of it, how is one thinking of it? To let all of that come into the light of awareness, so one isn't blindly ruled by it. Anxiety may be there, as one person told me still some anxiety sitting in the waiting room, but if it is seen, it just runs its course. It does not need to influence one's thinking, one's observing. So in that particular retreat, not having a room for a group of people to be who are intending to go to meeting, only had the sitting room, a hall, and then the meeting room. People just came into the meeting room, and when they left, they just tapped the next person, and that person came in. There was a time interval which was, even for that small space, relatively long. Here it would be longer because there's more space in between, and that space would get lost in meeting time. And yet maybe we can talk about it sometime and think about it, whether there would be something helpful in it, or whether it is not a thing for people to go there and sit there before a meeting. It also helps this area to remain a bit more quiet. A person does come in after a meeting, but not somebody else gets up at the same time, so it's only one person walking instead of two. The important thing being not to make a thing out of anything here, or to see what already has become a thing and one is not aware of it, and therefore it rules one's feelings and emotions and ideas. Being here now, is one somebody, a participant? Of course one is a participant, but does this become a thing in one's mind, so one has an identity to hang on to or to resent, to resist? One has to watch so astutely, so caringly, whether these identities and images are there, unobserved and undetected. You may say, well, what is wrong with having an identity here of being a sitter? I don't like to use the word Zen anymore. If we could magically make it disappear, I would go along with it immediately. Because it has so many associations of what is done in Zen centers, what one can achieve with a Zen training, the very concept of Zen training, leading to enlightenment. No training can lead to any enlightenment. The whole concept of enlightenment so closely linked with Zen training. What is it? One may ask, well, what's wrong with having this identity? People ask me this, not specifically with regard to this one, but saying, during my youth I had such a negative identity, finally I've built up a positive one. What's wrong with it now? If I think back to my youth, I was a mess, I was confused, maybe suicidal, all this negative identity. Finally I worked up this positive identity. It's necessary, or else I'll fall apart. In a retreat such as this, looking at identity, at images, at the attachment to them, really questioning it and probing it, is there a willingness to fall apart in the process? And, or rather, let's put it this way, to question and to probe what this falling apart really is, if it is just an idea, or whether it is just the dropping away of images. Not with no substitution, taking that risk, of not being anybody, not knowing who one is, and discerning the least bit of identity of being a sitter, a courageous sitter, a falling apart sitter, a suffering sitter. All of these subtle identities can be detected and drop in the detection. So when it sits there with nothing to hold on to, or does one immediately represent to oneself in thought what one is doing now, that one is now not holding on to anything? A tremendous attachment to ideas of oneself and what one is doing. And the very thinking process about oneself and affairs of the world. To think about it, to think it out, there's an attachment in that. And it is, if one watches it carefully, an escape of being right where one is, in the pain and anxiety of insecurity, of not knowing who one is, and not labeling and knowing from experience what is going on. Facing it without knowing. The word facing, people have told me this, and I understand what people are saying when they say this is not a good word, because it sounds as though there was a facer who faces himself or herself, which is again a dualistic, a division in the mind, a part in the mind observing or facing another part in the mind and body that is affected through the mind. But in reality, there's just what's going on this instant. Can there be awareness of it without taking any kind of a position, without trying to make anything out of it, without doing anything about it? As one observes, there's immediately the doer who needs to change it, overcome it, or escape. It goes so fast, so quick. And as this is going on, there's no awareness. What is awareness? There's retreat, retreat, retreat. Choo, choo. Ch, ch, ch. Is there just that, or is there immediately the habit, the urge, whatever we call it, to name it, or to wonder what it is, to represent it to oneself in thought? Can one see that process going on? Without saying, I shouldn't be doing this. If that thought comes up, I shouldn't be doing it, can it be noticed? That is awareness. To say I'm doing wrong, I am doing right, that's habitual thinking, which immediately shuts out awareness, which is without position. without someone who evaluates and grabs onto things or rejects them. But it is this very seeming entity that labels, evaluates, rejects, or clings, that we cling to. It is this feeling of me, my existence, without which I couldn't exist, an attachment to this existence as a knower, an evaluator, someone who is attached, identified. And a deep-seated fear of that coming to an end, of there being no one. Can that fear, as it comes up, come into awareness? And with it the subtle and immediate escape from it into something or other. Can that be seen too? Usually escape is no awareness. Fantasizing about something, thinking, remembering, projecting. And then the birds are not heard, and the breath is not experienced. And then miraculously one comes to again for an instant. Realizes there has been thinking and fantasizing. At that instant, can I just be listening to what's here, what's actually here, without knowing what's actually here, not feeding it through the process of interpreting it in the brain? The brain being quiet and listening what's there. One may find it's impossible for any length of time to be without an identity, without being someone. So quickly does it come up again. Becoming somebody. Somebody who needs to eat or who needs to do this, who in whatever job one has, one is identified with it, is one to watch it and clinging to that identity for dear life. And with that, shutting out the wholeness of life, which has no identity. Maybe one is wondering, why is this brought up again and again and again, talked about so much? But if one watches carefully one's relationships and one reads the newspapers and watches the news on television and on radio, it is so blatantly clear that all of our difficulties are mutually inflicted violence, terror, hatred. isolation is the outcome of this identity, be it the Russian, the American, the Palestinian, the Shiite Muslim or the Christian Jew. All fighting to keep their identity alive and protected and supreme at the expense of all other identities, which seem antagonistic and dangerous in the other person or in the other country. In the other religion. We turned on the television program the other day. It was on China. The title of that particular program was one of a series of programs on China. This one was Believing. It said Believing and tried to portray the survival of the different Chinese religious traditions, how people are today practice, a few people still maintaining some of the temples, the Buddhist temples, the Taoist temples, and how the Confucian ethic is still surviving among the Chinese people. And also included in this was a frequently occurring narrator who was a member of the Communist Party, an old man who had a very similar, almost esoteric smile as the Taoist, the Buddhist, talking with an appearance of deep wisdom and modesty, real modesty in the man, about the achievements of communism in China, how utterly hopeless and cruel and dangerous it was in his youth, with the wars and revolution and the exploitation of the landlords, and then the victory and the gradual economic improvement for the Chinese. And then his worry about the young people who haven't known all of this and who want more and more all the time. He says they have a television set, they have a bicycle, and they want more. But it's interesting that in that program this was part of the believing, and it is so, whether one believes in salvation through religion or through political system, it's the same believing and the same identity and the same defense of it, and wanting to pass it on, wanting to maintain it, and worrying that the children may not maintain it. Good section of the movie was devoted to showing how children are indoctrinated to believe in the party. They have their little chants about the Communist Party. And they perform it with enthusiasm and ardor. And you can see already how important a little child feels in doing that. Just before the program came up, we saw the tail end of another program. We don't know what the title of it was, but it was a conclusion about how good it is that the American flag is being more respected again among the young people. And they showed little children waving flags and wearing hats out of American flag in the round. Saying how healthy it is for this country to this renewal of patriotism. There's no difference. No difference between countries. No difference whether it's political or religious. This identity, to be somebody, to be proud of it, to hold on to it in this seeming ocean of insecurity. And not realizing the immense insecurity that comes out of all these different identities throughout this world. The danger of, not just the danger of constant collision, the actual fact of killing each other off, killing other identities off. So to observe this in oneself and question profoundly whether this can come to an end in oneself, whether it is at all possible to live without identity, watching carefully whether it won't grow up the next moment that one has figured one is finished with it, to be watchful of it, so that one's life will not be marred or divided or hate or opposition inspired by identity. It's a tremendous task. And it's arduous because there's such attachment to it. One has to see it. And under the attachment lurks such fear of being nobody. Without ever having faced this nobodiness. Not as a face it, but just allow it to happen. Without trying to make something out of it. Letting it happen, being nobody, or whichever way one experiences is this inner emptiness, which one constantly tries to fill. To let it happen once without doing anything about it. Is that possible? And not have any ideas or theories or conclusions about that this will make one fall apart. This is just the idea. One doesn't know what will happen. One has never given it a chance. And this is not a conscious decision, now I will face my emptiness. This is a new program, which can be very inspirational. I have something to do. Go out and search for my inner emptiness. It's there. Doesn't need to be searched after. It needs nothing. Some people have asked me, well, does it need a special environment to discover the truth about oneself? I don't know. I don't know what it takes. Obviously, awareness and attention is not tied to any environment, has nothing to do with environment. Let environment come into awareness. And to become attached to a special environment, one can observe the enclosure, the narrowness that ensues, the craving for it, the fear of not having it. But all of this can be seen, and can attachment to environment drop, and just observing in a quiet countryside what goes on in this mind? In our daily life, we're We may have a job many hours a day, 8 hours, but that's not all. Then there's commuting to and from the job, the traffic, the noise, the radios, then the family life, the obligations at home, the friends, the entertainments, the nervous system. The brain never has a chance to quiet down, to slow down. It just keeps going, going, going with constant demands. Many people who come to a retreat find how helpful it is in the quietness to feel this going, 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 which is still reverberating from the day or days before. And to let it reverberate in silence, with no one there criticizing it, wanting to alter it, realizing that there's nothing one can do about a brain that is reverberating other than listening. Deep down. Not just superficially saying, I'll let it reverberate, but deep down listening. Without any movement for or against. So out of this fast blur of motion, something is slowly detected, seen, and maybe dropped entirely. Please, if you find what is being said is said too fast or it is confusing, do bring it to a meeting. If you're afraid you won't remember it, you can jot something down on a note paper, and so you don't have to try to remember it, but you can look at it until the next meeting, and maybe things will clarify by themselves. Meetings are not places for explanation, but for looking at it again from scratch, going over the thing together. We will end here for today.